This is where it all started for Robert Durst when a fisherman noticed a dismembered body surface in the waters near Galveston. A jury found him not guilty of murder, but the judge who presided over the case says it's haunted her ever since.
Good afternoon, and welcome to True Crime Mysteries. If you're new to the channel, hello and welcome, and if you're returning, welcome back. Today, we are doing another serial killer deep dive, and this time, I wanted to cover an alleged serial killer that has recently been in the news due to his recent conviction, Robert Durst. This is going to be part 1 of 3. Let's get into it. Robert Durst, the would-be heir of multi-millionaire Seymour Durst, had been set to inherit an empire. However, multiple allegations of deceit, murder, and wild and violent outbursts caused him to be pushed far away from his family and far away from the legacy company that could have been his. Those closest to him often met violent, untimely, and unsolved ends. Until now. Robert Allen Durst was born on April 12, 1943, to Seymour Durst and Bernice Herstein. He and his 3 younger siblings, Douglas, Thomas, and Wendy, were raised in Scarsdale, New York, just north of the city where the family built their fortune. While Durst later became infamous in his own rights, he was born into a family whose name carried a lot of weight and wealth in New York City. Joseph Durst, Robert's grandfather, had built a billion-dollar real estate empire with the Durst Organization, starting with his first building purchase in 1912. Today, the company is one of the city's largest family-run real estate organizations, with his brother Douglas at the helm. Durst's younger years were fraught with trauma. When Durst was 7 years old, his mother fell off the roof of their home and died. Durst claimed that his father had brought him to the window and witnessed her death, though his brother Douglas disputes that claim. At the time, the newspapers had said Bernice had fallen off the roof after overdosing on asthma medication, but some family members, including Robert, claimed it was suicide. Durst struggled with his mental health after his mother's death. When he was 10 years old, he was assessed by a psychiatrist who claimed Durst couldn't be treated because he had personality decomposition and possibly even schizophrenia. Durst attended Scarsdale High School, where classmates described him as a loner. He then attended Pennsylvania's Lehigh University, where he graduated in 1965 with a bachelor's degree in economics. He then enrolled in a doctoral program at the University of California in Los Angeles, where he met Susan Berman, an aspiring writer who quickly became his close friend. Durst withdrew from the UCLA program and moved back to New York in 1969. In the fall of 1971, he met Kathie McCormick, an 18-year-old dental hygienist who lived in one of the buildings owned by the Durst Organization. They had met when Durst went to pick up the rent. Kathie had just moved to New York City from Long Island. She was a bright, charming young woman who was incredibly warm and likable the moment she walked into a room. The two instantly hit it off. Kathie didn't mind his cool affection and described him as sweet and sensitive. In the early 1970s, Durst opened a health food store in Vermont called All Good Things. After just 2 dates together, Durst asked Kathleen to move into his home near the store, and in January of 1972, she took him up on the offer. The couple were smitten, though there were many times when the couple's 10-year age gap caused issues. The two also came from 2 totally different worlds. Durst from wealth and power, Kathie came from a modest Irish Catholic household. She had very much been swept up in the lifestyle that came along with being a Durst. A year later, after pressure from his father to move back to New York City and work for the Durst organization, Robert closed his health food store and moved back to the city with Kathleen. On Durst's 30th birthday, April 12, 1973, the two were married. Their marriage had started off a loving one, but when they moved from Vermont back to New York, there had been a remarkable change. Kathie said that Seymour Durst brought out the worst in Bobby, and he had turned into a completely different person from the man she fell in love with in Vermont. At first, Bobby loved showing Kathie off, taking her to the best and biggest events in New York and showing her his world. It was a world where Kathie shined brightly, and even Seymour approved of his new daughter-in-law. But as time went on, Robert's affections turned even colder, and for a long while Kathie kept just how miserable she was to herself. Occasionally, she would drop hints that Robert had an anger problem. At first it was just yelling, then turned to pretending to hit her, but each year the hints would get worse and worse, until eventually they were no longer hints. Kathleen's brother Jim McCormick said he first witnessed Durst abusing Kathleen at a family Christmas party when he grabbed her by the hair. Kathleen had kept numerous diaries filled with details about how Kathleen had been suffering in the marriage. Robert was cheap and, despite having a vast bank account, watched over every penny that Kathleen spent. People never understood why the budding socialite married to a millionaire was working so hard in medical school to become a doctor. She would laugh and tell people it was her calling and that she wanted to have a career on her own, but becoming a doctor also would give her some freedoms, money that she earned herself and could be spent or saved as she needed. A few years into their marriage, Durst had dropped a bombshell. He didn't want children, which devastated Kathie. She poured her disappointment into school, but it had caused a fracture in their relationship that never quite repaired. Durst said that he might consider adopting, which had given Kathie a little hope, but every time she set up an appointment with an agency, Durst refused to go. In 1976, Kathie got pregnant. Durst was enraged and accused her of getting pregnant on purpose. He forced her to get an abortion, threatening divorce if she didn't. She went through with the procedure but fell into a downward spiral of grief and depression. It was also around this time when she learned for the first time that Durst was having an affair. She had learned of the affair when she discovered Polaroid pictures of their medicine cabinet and closets. When she asked what the photos were, Durst revealed he'd had a woman in their home, and he'd moved things around to make the apartment appear to be only occupied by him. He had used the photos to put everything back where it belonged before Kathie returned. This had caused an unrepairable rift between the couple. After this, no love remained in their relationship, and Kathie seemed to be the only one suffering. In early 1982, 29-year-old Kathleen was in her final year of school at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, studying to become a pediatrician. That same year, she was treated for facial bruises at the Bronx Hospital. She had confided to a friend that Durst had beaten her when she confronted him about another affair. She knew he'd taken up with a woman named Prudence Farrow, the same Prudence that the Beatles sang about in Dear Prudence. The stresses of medical school alone were crippling enough, but the near-daily physical and emotional abuse was breaking Kathie. She began to drink excessively and use drugs to cope with the abuse. She barely slept or ate, and friends noticed their once bubbly, bright friend was a shell of her former self, detached and constantly frayed and nervous.
In the beginning, it was Prince Charming and Cinderella. Time went by, I would say that it became more and more violent. When I was in law school and she was in medical school, I had call forwarded to where I was, and she would call me late at night for hours about his violence.
She said to me, Gilberta, promise me if something happens, you'll check it out. I'm afraid of Bobby. And I just said, Kathie, of course.
You're angry that, that this can't be happening. You're basically in disbelief. Kathie had a heart of gold. She loved Bob. She absolutely loved him at the very beginning. And he was good to her. I believe he loved her.
Kathleen wanted a divorce and began telling friends that she was going to leave Durst once she finally finished medical school. Durst caught wind of that, and in response, he canceled her credit cards, removed her from their joint bank account, and refused to pay for her next semester's college tuition. She then demanded a divorce and $250,000 settlement. She had told friends she was threatening Durst. She claimed to have proof that Durst had been embezzling money from his father and had made fraudulent claims on his tax returns as well as her own. Soon before Kathleen disappeared, she was at her New York City apartment with two friends, Bill Stevenson and George Kearns. According to Bill, he had gone to the city multiple times to help Kathleen plan an escape from her violent marriage. One morning, Bill said Durst showed up at the door, threw a wad of cash at Kathleen's face, and said, "This isn't happening," referring to the divorce. Kathleen told Robert she was done and moving to Delaware. George, who also witnessed the incident, said that there was a lot of yelling and screaming. He said, "Whatever happened could have happened that morning if we hadn't been there. I mean, he had just no control over himself, just kind of out of his mind, angry." 10 days later, Kathleen was gone. Kathleen was last seen alive on January 31st, 1982. She had attended a dinner party without Robert at her friend Gilberte Najami's home in Connecticut. She had shown up unexpectedly and, according to Gilberte, wasn't acting like herself. While Kathleen typically wore high-quality clothes, she showed up in red sweatpants. She was also visibly upset when she arrived at Gilberte's. Durst called her multiple times during her visit, screaming through the phone for her to come home. Though she didn't want to, she eventually left the party to return to their house in the South Salem hamlet of Westchester County, New York. Gilberte said in an interview, "The last conversation that I had with Kathie was a very powerful conversation. As she was leaving my house, she turned to me and said, 'Gilberta, promise me if something happens to me, you'll check it out. I'm afraid of what Bobby might do.' It was the last time anyone besides Robert sees Kathleen."
Kathie told anybody who would listen, all her friends, if anything ever happens to me, look to Bob. Bob did it. Don't let him get away with it. The moment Kathie disappeared, I knew that Bob had done away with her. I was hoping against hope that really maybe he had just beaten her up and we'd find her some way, but I knew she was dead.
According to him, he and Kathleen argued that night. Kathleen wanted to go to their apartment in the city instead of staying at the house, so he dropped her off at the Katanoa train station to get the 9:15 p.m. train to Manhattan. Afterwards, as he told the New York City Police Department, he went for a walk, had a drink at his neighbor's house, spoke with Kathleen on a payphone, and then went to bed. The neighbors he allegedly had seen, Bill and Ruth Mayer, later testified that Durst lied to the police and that he never visited them on the night of Kathleen's disappearance. Ruth also testified that Kathleen had told her in private that Durst was abusing her. Though Ruth encouraged her to report it, Kathleen was afraid to. Before her disappearance, Kathleen had made plans to meet Gilberte at a pub in Manhattan, but Kathleen never showed. Gilberte was worried and called the police several times over the next few days after not seeing or hearing from Kathleen. On February 4th, Kathleen's college called Durst and said she'd called in sick on February 1st and had missed a full week of classes. And so, on February 5th, Durst reported his wife missing. Detectives wondered why Durst had waited so long to report his wife missing. He He very calmly explained that he and Kathie often spent days apart when she was working and studying so much at the hospital. He was described as completely calm and unmoved. He seemed completely unfazed that his wife had been missing for several days. What had made things even more peculiar, he took to the press soon after, offering a $100,000 reward for information leading to her safe return, though he later reduced it, saying the original article had made a mistake. Kathleen's family found out in the newspapers, having no idea that Kathleen had gone missing. Due to his high-profile status, the disappearance, and Durst himself gained a lot of media attention, so his longtime friend Susan Berman stepped in as his unofficial spokeswoman, making statements and answering questions on his behalf. During the initial police investigation, the doorman at Kathleen and Durst's Manhattan apartment building claimed to have seen Kathleen at the building on February 1st, but he only saw her from behind and far away, so he wasn't certain if it was her. He later told investigators that he hadn't seen her at all, and that he actually might not have even been working during that time. 3 weeks after Durst reported Kathleen missing, the building's superintendent found her belongings in the building's trash compactor. Kathleen's friends took her disappearance into their own hands and broke into Kathleen and Durst's South Salem home in hopes that they'd find her. They'd either find her or find clues to her whereabouts. When they arrived, the house had been turned upside down. Kathleen's mail had been ripped open and her belongings were stuffed into the garbage. In their Manhattan apartment, Durst had thrown so many belongings into the garbage chute that led to the building's incinerator that the building manager asked him to stop because he was clogging up the chute. He threw out her clothes, medical school books, jewelry, everything that belonged to Kathie. When Kathie's friends had been searching the South Salem home, they also found an itinerary that they thought had been written by Durst.
I went through his garbage, and I found that he was throwing her things out right away. Within 5 weeks at least of her disappearance. He knew she wasn't coming back.
It outlined every single thing he did that night that Kathleen went missing, as well as the days following. They passed it on to the lead detective working the case, who agreed it was an odd thing to do. Innocent people don't need to write down an exact minute-by-minute recounting of their day, though someone who needed to keep their lives straight might. While New York City police explored leads and questioned Durst, it didn't go unnoticed that higher-ups were not pushing them to solve the case. The investigation had only been a few weeks in when it was already beginning to wind down. Normally, high-profile cases like this would bring in all sorts of people to breathe down the necks of detectives. Not this case. It seemed that the Durst family didn't care about New York's finest working the case at all. They certainly weren't cooperating with law enforcement. Durst refused interviews, polygraph tests, and even answering the most basic questions, though he did take several interviews with reporters.
Did you have anything to do with the death of your wife?
I don't know that she's dead.
Do you think that it's possible that she's alive now?
It's possible. Not likely.
At first playing the role of concerned and sympathetic husband, though his tone quickly turned to annoyed and began to slander Kathleen. He told the press that he believed Kathleen had left him and would run off with another man. There was so little evidence in Kathleen's disappearance. Law enforcement had even worked with several psychics to try and develop new leads. Though they had suspicions Durst was involved, he had lawyered up with one of the best criminal attorneys in New York, and without evidence, the case went cold, and slowly Robert Durst's missing first wife was reduced to a file in a cold case locker. After Kathie's disappearance, Robert Durst takes a big step back from the New York City social scene he once dominated. He only kept a close circle of friends, primarily just consisting of Susan Berman and a select few others. Between 1990 and 2000, Durst attempted to reinvent himself, starting with his marriage. In 1990, he sold the South Salem home that he and Kathleen shared, and unbeknownst to Kathleen's family, filed for divorce from his still missing wife, claiming spousal abandonment. Durst allegedly started behaving oddly at work, which included urinating in trash cans. While he was next in line to take over his family's company, his father Seymour appointed his younger brother Douglas to the position in 1994 instead. Durst accused his brother of stealing the company from him, causing a rift between Robert and the rest of the family. In 1999, the New York City Police reopened Kathleen's missing person case. They searched Durst's former South Salem home for the time, as well as the nearby Truesdale Lake. Then, in 2000, the investigation into Kathleen's disappearance became public. In November of 2000, Durst left New York after his sister Wendy told him that police were reopening Kathleen's case. He escaped the city to avoid police inquiries and started renting a $300 a month apartment in Galveston, Texas, where no one knew who he was. While living in Galveston, he pretended to be a mute woman named Dorothy Siner, a name he took from a high school friend. While in Galveston, he was spotted wearing women's wigs around town and visiting the library to look up articles about himself. Durst later said he posed as a mute woman because of his distinctive voice. He believed anyone would have been able to identify him if he spoke. The next month, Durst married Deborah Cheriton, a Manhattan real estate broker he had been dating off and on for the past decade. It was a hasty ceremony officiated by a single rabbi picked out of the phone book. They are still married to this day, though they've reportedly never lived together over the course of their marriage and have gone years without speaking. Little is known about his time in Texas. Little is known about why he married Deborah so hastily. Though in New York, spouses are legally exempt from testifying about their spouse, and are also exempt from disclosing confidential communication. Then, according to Durst, Susan Berman called him in December of 2000. The police wanted to interview her about Kathleen's disappearance. In December of 2000, Susan Berman was living alone at her home in Benedict Canyon, Los Angeles, where she was working as a journalist and author. A so-called mafia princess, Susan wrote about her family ties to reported gangsters, more specifically her father, Davy Berman, a Las Vegas mob boss. Susan and Durst became fast friends after meeting as students at UCLA. When she was 12, her father had died on the operating table, and her mother had died of a drug overdose a year later. These traumas bonded Susan to Durst, as he believed his mother had also committed suicide by jumping off the roof of their home as a child. Susan would call Durst the little brother she never had and was very protective of him. When Susan got married in 1984, it was Durst who walked her down the aisle. The two had been nearly inseparable for decades. When Kathleen had disappeared, Susan had been Durst's unofficial spokesperson. He would give her statements through Susan, and she had also been his alibi for the night Kathleen had gone missing. However, she and Durst drifted apart when he disappeared out of the blue for years. She eventually left New York, settling in California instead, where she wrote 2 books about her life as a mob boss's daughter. Though her life was actually quite sad, she spun it to sound like an incredibly glamorous life growing up as mob royalty. Susan was also an incredibly paranoid person. She always thought people were after her because of her work. Though many of the people she wrote about were long gone, and a lot of the old mafia days she had experienced as a child were long gone by the 2000s. No one else really gave credit to her paranoia. They always described her as being incredibly hyperbolic, dramatic, and over the top. Leading up to her death, Susan was short on money. She was facing eviction from her home and was absolutely flat broke, and in desperation, she reached out to Durst. Though she wasn't able to get a hold of him conventionally, she instead left a voicemail message on a phone number he maintained in New York. Without a word, he gifted her $50,000 that she used to pay her debts and get herself back on track. She had recently been hired to work on a couple new big projects. Things were starting to look up for Susan. She had been grateful to have the little brother she never had back in her life. However, she was contacted by the Westchester District Attorney Janine Pirro, who informed Susan she was reopening the Kathie Durst case 18 years later and wanted to interview her. Susan had never been interviewed in the initial investigation. The interview had been arranged to take place sometime early in the new year, and somehow the fact that the new DA wanted to interview Susan Berman had made front-page news in New York. On December 19th, Susan spoke with her friend, actress Kim Langford, telling her that she had the story of a lifetime and had information that was going to blow the top off things. Kim assumed the information was related to a project she was working on about her life growing up around the mob in Vegas. She also told Kim she had recently spoken to a psychic, who had told her she'd die a violent death that involved a gun. On Christmas Eve in 2000, police were called to Susan's home after neighbors reported that her dogs were running loose on the street and barking wildly. Police arrived at Susan's home and found the back door ajar. In the doorway of one of the bedrooms, they found Susan Berman, 55 years old. She had been shot execution style, with one bullet to the back of the head. There were no signs of forced entry and nothing appeared to have been stolen. Police determined she'd been murdered a day or two before the discovery of the body. Some speculated that it was a mob hit, made in retaliation for the information she was about to reveal in this upcoming project. Others suspected her manager, Niall Brenner, who she reportedly had a very turbulent relationship. Friends said that because of Susan's career, she was extremely paranoid. They said she always had her home locked up tight and never opened the door to strangers, so they felt it was unlikely that she had been murdered by someone she didn't know. That left only a handful of people who Susan trusted implicitly. But when Westchester County District Attorney Janine Pirro revealed that Susan had been on the short list of witnesses she wanted to speak to about Kathleen's disappearance, many of Kathleen's friends speculated Durst had killed Susan to keep her quiet, though those from Susan's social circle said she wouldn't have testified against him due to her mob-like loyalty. Soon after Susan's body was discovered, Los Angeles police received an anonymous letter postmarked for December 23rd. The letter was addressed to the Beverly Hills Police, with Beverly misspelled. Inside the note had Susan's address with one word: cadaver. As it turns out, Susan did have key information to share. According to her friend, Linda Obst, Susan told her that she was the one that called the New York Albert Einstein College of Medicine on February 1st when she had allegedly called in sick. According to the prosecuting attorney, Durst asked Susan to cover for him when Kathleen had first disappeared, by posing as Kathleen and calling in sick to school so people would believe she'd made it to Manhattan. They theorized that Durst had killed Susan after discovering her scheduled interview with the police, fearing she'd turn him in. Miriam Barnes, Susan's close friend, testified that Susan called her and told her that she'd done a favor for Durst, but was nervous telling her about it. She told Miriam, "If anything happens to me, Bobby did it." A closer look into Durst's activity revealed he'd been in California in late December and had left on a late-night flight from San Francisco to New York on the day she was murdered. At the time of the investigation, Durst was questioned about Susan's murder, but never charged. Robert Durst did not attend the funeral of his oldest and dearest friend, Susan Berman. On September 30th, 2001, a man fishing with his son in Galveston Bay discovered a human torso floating in the water. They called the police and searched the area and found several garbage bags, each bag containing dismembered body parts. A total of 12 bags were found. In the bags, they also found an outer packaging for a bow saw, a receipt for garbage bags and drop cloths, and a newspaper that contained a handwritten note, an address, 2213 Avenue K. At the address, officers searched the garbage cans nearby, where they found more black garbage bags similar to the ones they had already recovered. Inside the dumpsters, they found an empty trash bag box, packaging for a drop cloth, packaging for a 4-inch paring knife, a .22 caliber shell casing, and an eviction notice addressed to Morris Black. Morris Black was one of the tenants in the shared home on Avenue K. He had been a veteran with a murky past. He was estranged from his family and his ex-wife. He lived a nomadic life, and if he occasionally reached out to someone, he never disclosed where he was. He had landed in Texas sometime in the mid-90s, and he'd been arrested in '98 for threatening to blow up a utility company over an issue with his bill. His lifestyle made it hard for a timeline of his life to be tracked down. There were decades of time without any documentation tying him to any particular place. Those in Galveston who had met Morris described him as a grumpy old man who was suspicious of everyone and prone to screaming outbursts. He used to live in New York, but seemed to have gone off the grid in 1982. It was also discovered that Black had $130,000 in an out-of-state bank account. Despite not having worked for decades, he had been living off of the money for many years. Friends and family of Black had no idea he had that kind of money, and he was now missing. They were able to execute a search warrant for Morris's home. Once inside, they discovered blood evidence everywhere, in the bathroom sink, the kitchen, in all of the drains. They sprayed luminol throughout the apartment, and it lit up like Christmas. Walls, floors, and drag marks that led from Morris's apartment to the apartment across the hall. The apartment across the hall belonged to Dorothy Siner, a mute old woman whose neighbors had little to offer about who this woman was. She was rarely seen, had been known to travel frequently, kept her shades drawn, and kept to herself. Investigators got a court order to enter, and again found blood everywhere. In Dorothy's kitchen, there had been several cuts in the linoleum, and when officers pulled it back, they had discovered pools of dried blood underneath. Unlike in Morris's apartment, this apartment hadn't been cleaned as thoroughly. There was dry blood splatter all over the place, along with a paring knife, a cleaver, a handsaw, and a pistol, which was suspected to be the murder weapon. One of the bags recovered from the bay was empty. It had a large rip in it, and officers concluded that it was the one that contained Morris's head, which was the only body part not recovered. It also likely contained key evidence that would answer the question that still remained: cause of death. They had been able to compare fingerprints from Morris's time in the military to those on the body to identify him. A medical examiner determined that the body parts recovered from the bay were that of 71-year-old Morris Black.
Did it look like somebody who was doing this in a panic?
This looked like someone had done this before. And the medical examiner testified that the person who cut this body up knew what kind of instrument to use on what bone and what muscle and what part of the body.
Do you think it's possible that Robert Durst is guilty of more than 3 murders?
Well, I do believe that he's guilty of more than 3 murders, just because I saw what he did to the body of Morris Black.
Dorothy Siner was also missing, and police turned their attention to finding her. They had been able to determine that Morris had likely been murdered in his apartment, but had been dismembered in her apartment. Why had a man been dismembered in an old mute lady's apartment? It didn't make sense. They were able to unravel Dorothy's true identity when they found a receipt in the building's trash. It was from a local optometrist, and it had Durst's name on it. With that information, they concluded that perhaps there wasn't a Miss Siner. Perhaps Robert Durst had been masquerading as an old mute woman. Neighbors couldn't recall seeing Dorothy around the time that Morris disappeared, though they did recall seeing a man loading garbage bags into a Honda CR-V. They hadn't recognized him, but noted he made several trips in and out of Dorothy's apartment. Police took down a description of the vehicle and put out a bolo. They also looked in the national databases to try and get any information they could about Miss Siner. They found her, and she was alive, but claimed to not reside in Galveston, Texas, and she certainly wasn't mute. When asked if she knew Robert Durst, she replied that she did. They had attended high school together back in the 50s. She was baffled. She hadn't spoken to Durst in decades, and had no idea why there was an apartment rented using her name and social security number. 7 days later, a vehicle matching the description is found, and they pull over the driver and search the car. Inside, they saw a bow saw and visible blood in the trunk of the vehicle. They arrested the 58-year-old driver on October 9, 2001, a man named Robert Durst, and charged him with the murder of Morris Black. After paying a $300,000 bail, Durst left Texas and went on the run. After failing to appear at his court date, he was declared a fugitive. While on the run, Durst had the nerve to rent a car in Mobile, Alabama, under the name Morris Black. And then, in another strange twist, he was found and arrested at a Wegmans grocery store in Bath, Pennsylvania. He was accused of shoplifting a $6 chicken sandwich, bandages, and a newspaper. And even though he had $38,000 in cash with him at the time, along with 2 loaded handguns, also in his car was a Medicaid card and a driver's license belonging to Morris Black. Durst had also shaved all of his hair as well as his eyebrows, and at first he hadn't been recognized as the Millionaire fugitive. It was only when the arresting officer ran his social security number that he discovered the warrant for his arrest. In January of 2002, he returned to Texas to stand trial for the murder of Morris Black. According to Durst's testimony, he came home on September 28, 2001, to find Morris in his apartment, angry. While Morris had a key to the apartment, Durst hadn't been expecting him. Durst said that he immediately suspected Morris of taking the gun that he'd stored in the oven. When Durst asked him where it was, Morris reportedly stood and pointed it at Durst. Durst claimed that he grabbed the gun and the 2 men fell to the ground. That's when the gun went off, though he says he never touched the trigger and killed Morris with a gunshot to the head. Durst claims he tried to get the help of a neighbor, but no one answered. So he went back to his apartment and started cleaning up the blood himself. He said he then drank a bottle of Jack Daniels and dismembered Morris's body before dumping it in the Galveston Bay. Durst said he didn't go to the police because he didn't think they'd believe him, given his past, reputation, and suspicious situation. Though according to a private investigator, Bobby Baca, she had been able to piece a connection going way back of Durst and Morris Black. Morris had a brother, Harry Black, and the 2 of them owned a construction business in New York back in the 80s. According to family members, it had been funded by the Durst organization, specifically Robert Durst. Harry had passed in 2003, but his wife had said that when he learned that Morris had been murdered, he was concerned that he would be next. When asked why, he said that he knew dark secrets. Black's wife told Baca that she believed that the brothers knew something about Kathie Durst's disappearance. Prosecutors believe that Durst murdered Morris when he found out his true identity, and he killed him out of fear that he'd been found and charged with Kathleen's murder. Robert had specifically chosen Galveston, and he arrived concealing his identity as an old woman, only to show up at a low-income housing building next door to a man that he used to fund to do work for him. And if we believe that Durst murdered Susan to tie up a loose end regarding Kathleen's disappearance, perhaps Black had also been connected in some way. In his trial, Durst had hired the best criminal defense attorneys that money could buy. The trial lasted over 2 months, and despite a mountain of evidence, on November 11, 2003, Durst was found not guilty of Morris's death and was acquitted.
Glenda Brentz was an alternate juror in the Robert Durst murder trial. She's convinced the New York real estate heir's testimony, full of holes and inconsistencies, should have landed him with a guilty verdict. Instead, he'll walk away.
In my opinion, it was his story against the evidence, and I didn't believe his story.
But the 8-man, 4-woman jury disagreed.
It wasn't proven, so you have reasonable doubt.
The jurors say there wasn't enough evidence to rule out Durst's claim that the gun went off accidentally as he struggled with neighbor Morris Black in September of 2001. Prosecutors are in disbelief.
Mr. Durst is not going to be invited to my house for any reason at all.
Though acknowledging Durst's history as an unusual character, a loner prone to drug and alcohol binges, the jury stands by its decision to acquit.
I wouldn't be asking him to escort my daughter to her senior prom this year, but, I can't say where Durst will live. Durst is not the only crazy person in Galveston.
It was a shocking end to a brutal trial. He was initially put on a $3 billion bail due to his previous bail jumping and tampering with evidence, but the amount was eventually lowered to $450,000 after a court found the amount unconstitutional. In October of 2004, just as he was about to be paroled, Pennsylvania authorities charged Durst with weapon possession stemming from his time on the lam. In July of 2005, he was released from federal prison and sent to Texas to serve parole. But Durst couldn't seem to stay in one place. In December of 2005, he was arrested for a parole violation for making unauthorized trips to Galveston. He got caught after visiting a Texas mall, where he happened to run into the judge who was presiding over his murder trial. In February of 2006, Durst was released from prison, and his parole supervision ended 9 months later. Once again, he was a free man.
You testified at Durst's parole hearing, and it wasn't long after that that you found a dismembered cat on your doorstep. Why do you think Durst was involved with that?
When I came home and I drove up, I saw something right at the foot of my sidewalk, and at first I thought it was a dead rat. And as I got out of my car and focused on it, I realized it was a severed cat head with the front 2 legs attached. And I thought, oh my God, what in the world is that? Is that really what I think it is? And as I'm trying to process this, it dawns on me that this is a severed head. And this was done perfectly. It was clean. This was a hot June 29th day in Texas, which is very, very hot. Mm-hmm. There wasn't a drop of blood. There wasn't a body fluid. There wasn't a hair out of place. And it was laid there perfectly with the front 2 paws crossed. Mm-hmm. It was placed there very, 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 very carefully. So I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, oh my God, what is this? And it hit me, oh my God, this is a severed head. And I knew that he'd had a history of destroying animals and cutting up animals and doing horrible things to them. Mm. And I thought back to that moment when he was in my chambers and he was looking at all of my pictures when he was angry about me not allowing a cartoon in for their defense. And I ran into my house thinking, oh God, please let my dogs be okay. And they were fine. But it was the fact that it hit me that it was a severed head.
And when you, the part of the reason you linked this to him was, of course, you had testified at that parole hearing, you had been the judge in the case. But you mentioned other things he'd done to animals. His family has raised questions about this, and I'll note it's his family. We don't know if, none of this has been fully substantiated, but according to his brother, he had dogs. They were all Alaskan Malamutes, all named Igor. All of them mysteriously disappeared, one after the other, all of these dogs. So do you believe this story? What do you think happened to those dogs?
Well, actually, I didn't hear them from the Durst family. I'd heard it from several people, including Jim McCormick, Kathie's brother. And during the trial, there was a photograph introduced that was found on Bob when he was arrested in Pennsylvania that had him and Kathie in it and had the dog in it. And the dog's name was Igor. Well, then later when he was talking in the tapes that I listened to, he was talking about another dog that he'd had more recently named Igor. Well, I thought that dog can't be 20 years old. And so later I was told by Jim that he had a succession of dogs and every one of them was named Igor and every one of them died an unnatural, mysterious death.
And there was a moment on those tapes where you think he used the word Igor to refer to a human being or what he wanted to do to a human being?
Yes, I do. There was a time when he was talking to his wife, Deborah, about going to his brother's house when he was on the run. Mm-hmm. And he stood in the driveway, and there was some sort of a social event going on, and he told his wife that he thought about doing an Igor to his brother. And his wife stopped and said, stop, stop, stop. This is a recorded line, Bob. And it was clear what he meant, and it was clear that she understood what he meant, enough to stop him from talking anymore on a recorded line.
Four years later, Durst's infamous deeds were brought to the big screen for the first time. In December of 2010, All Good Things, a movie loosely based on Durst's life, starring Ryan Gosling and Kirsten Dunst, debuted. The movie is about a man who kills his wife, best friend, neighbor, and dog. After its release, Durst contacted the director and praised the movie, but said that he didn't like that the dog was murdered. Him and the director Andrew Jarecki kept in contact over the years, and despite Durst's lawyer's advice against it, Durst eventually agreed to appear in an interview for the HBO documentary series Jarecki was making about Durst's life. It was called The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst. Jarecki first interviewed Durst in 2010 during which Durst denied any responsibility for Susan and Kathleen's deaths and disappearances.
Did not tell the whole truth. Nobody tells the whole truth.
Did you have anything to do with the death of your wife?
I don't know that she's dead.
Do you think that it's possible that she's alive now?
It's possible. Not likely. I felt terrible for Susan. I was astonished that they were putting all this together, that I did it or I caused it to be done. An interview is a big risk for you. Why do you want to do an interview?
With the help of Susan's stepson, it was a letter written by Durst, and it includes the same misspelling of Beverly. In his second interview with Durst, Drecke brought out both letters and confronted Durst with the similarities. During a break, Durst goes to the bathroom and is recorded saying this.
Or maybe this is the bathroom.
Yeah, that's...
You're right, this is the bathroom. There it is. You're caught. You're right, of course. But you can't imagine. What's in the house? Oh, I want this. Disaster. Right. Irish. Listen. I'm having difficulty with the question. What the hell did I do? Kill them all, of course.
In the interview, Durst also admits to lying about what he told police about the night Kathleen went missing. That he told police he dropped her off at the train station and visited his neighbors because it was what they wanted to hear. In 2013, the director began sharing his footage and discoveries with the police. In 2014, the filmmakers discovered the recording of Durst seemingly admitting to the murders, and the LAPD concluded that Durst authored the cadaver letter sent to the police, arming them with the evidence needed to arrest Durst. The day before the final documentary episode aired, March 14, 2015, Durst was arrested on a warrant charging him with the first-degree murder of Susan Berman.
He's the infamous heir to one of the country's wealthiest real estate families, long suspected in connection with a pair of murders and a disappearance dating back decades. Tonight, Robert Durst is behind bars, arrested overnight in the lobby of a New Orleans hotel, accused of killing a female friend in Los Angeles 15 years ago. The investigation got a boost in recent weeks thanks to new evidence revealed in a documentary series that Durst willingly participated in. Law enforcement sources say they feared Durst, who was using a fake name, was a flight risk. We begin tonight with NBC's Stephanie Gosk.
Robert Durst, heir to a multi-billion-dollar real estate fortune, sits in a New Orleans jailhouse tonight awaiting extradition to California, accused of a murder committed over a decade ago. This from his own brother today. We are relieved and also grateful to everyone who assisted in the arrest of Robert Durst. We hope he will finally be held accountable for all he has done. Christmas Eve 2000, Susan Berman was killed execution-style in her LA home. At the time, investigators may have suspected the now 71-year-old, but there was no arrest. Berman was Durst's best friend and confidant. He denies murdering her in HBO series The Jinx.
Police found him at the JW Marriott Hotel in New Orleans, along with a .38 caliber revolver, marijuana, $40,000 in cash, a map of Cuba, a shoulder-to-head latex mask, fake IDs, and his legitimate passport. Police suspected he was preparing to flee the country to Cuba. Durst was arraigned the next morning and held on bail pending an extradition hearing. The next day, he waived extradition so he could face the murder charge in LA, but it was delayed after Louisiana State Police charged him with felony weapon possession. The New Orleans judge denied Durst bail on the charges and determined Durst to be a flight risk. In February 2016, he accepted the plea deal on the charges and was sentenced to just over 7 years in prison. In November of 2016, Durst was transferred to Los Angeles County Jail to await trial for the murder of Susan Berman. During questioning, he tells a prosecutor that he was high on meth when asked why he would agree to be interviewed for the Jinx.
When I did the interviews for the Jinx, I was on meth. The whole time I was on meth.
The next year, Kathleen McCormick Durst was declared legally dead at the request of her family. Her family alleged from the beginning that Durst was involved with her disappearance and murder. The trial for Susan Berman's murder began on March 4th, 2020, but it was halted for 14 months due to the COVID-19 pandemic. In May of 2021, the case was resumed.
Mr. Durst, how do you feel about being in court today?
I'm not particularly happy about it. Other places I'd much rather be.
And when you say you're not particularly happy about it, can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I'm here at my brother's trial, and it's not a pleasant experience to be at this trial of somebody I've known for 76 years now, and it's very difficult from many points of view.
Do you recognize this person here?
My brother Bob, yes.
Indicating the defendant, Your Honor?
Yeah.
Growing up, how did your brother treat you?
He treated me miserably. He would fight with me every chance. He would embarrass me at every opportunity. And it was a very difficult relationship.
And do you recall when he called you, what was his demeanor?
It was his tone was very neutral, and there was no great anxiety in his tone.
Did that seem unusual to you at the time?
It seemed a little strange, yes.
In things you've listened to, dealings you've had, statements you've been made aware of, has your brother indicated how he feels about you to this day?
Yes.
And what are those feelings?
He'd like to murder me.
And are you aware of your brother, in fact, making calls from Pennsylvania discussing that very subject?
I am aware of that, yes.
Did you take those, and this is a yes or no question, do you take those threats seriously?
Yes, I did.
And even in terms of your coming to court today, did you come with security that you had hired?
Yes, I hired security today.
And why did you hire security? What was the reason for that?
Because I have fear that my brother has threatened to kill me, and I have fear that he may have the means to do so.
And in terms of the security that you've hired and the concerns that you have, do they expressly relate back to the fear of your brother?
Yes.
Did you kill Susan Berman?
No.
Do you know who did?
No, I do not.
Do you realize you have an absolute right not to testify?
I am aware of that.
Do you want to testify in your own behalf?
Yes.
I want to first ask you about some of your health problems. Are you hard of hearing?
I am hard of hearing.
You've heard Tommy, your little brother, testify here that he resented you to this day for pulling a trick on him in a revolving door. Do you remember that event?
remember Tommy's testimony. I don't remember the incident. Tommy said, and this is when he was an adult, so I don't know how old we were then. I don't remember when he was talking about me ignoring him in the revolving door. It was not when he was little. He was a grown-up.
What did you do after you and Kathie came back from your honeymoon?
I went to work at the Durst organization. It was just like I expected it to be, and I did not love it. I barely liked it at all. I was in a room with a whole bunch of suits.
During Susan Berman's trial, it was announced that Kathleen's case had been reclassified as murder and would be reinvestigated as a homicide case.
Her family wants to know what took so long to press charges. They're urging Westchester County's DA to investigate whether it was a cover-up.
We're going to go after everybody who got paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to participate in this cover-up.
Why did a series of district attorneys in Manhattan and Westchester County appear to decide to protect Robert Durst all these years? 2, why did the NYPD fail to conduct a competent and thorough investigation into Kathie's disappearance? Telling me, quote, we dropped the ball, unquote, just doesn't cut it. 3, although we appreciate the actions now being taken by DA Rocha, why did prior leaders of the Westchester District Attorney's Office agree to stand down so that Durst could be prosecuted in California for killing someone who helped him cover up Kathie's murder? 4, why did former DA Jeanine Pirro commence an investigation only to abandon it at the last minute?
On September 17th, after 3 days of jury deliberation, Robert Durst was found guilty of first-degree murder of Susan Berman, as well as lying in wait and killing a witness. Less than a month later, Los Angeles County Judge Mark Windham sentenced Durst to life in prison without the possibility of parole. That same month, the Westchester County, New York District Attorney's Office announced the Westchester County Grand Jury would be impaneled to hear witness testimonies and evidence in Kathleen's disappearance. In late October, Durst tested positive for COVID-19 and was hospitalized. The state investigator, believing Durst may not live long enough to be indicted, filed a criminal complaint charging him in Kathleen's death. On November 1st, 2021, Durst was indicted by the Westchester County Grand Jury on second-degree murder charges of Kathleen McCormick Durst and is currently awaiting trial. Time will tell if he lives long enough to face it. Though the decades-long horror show put on by Durst may soon come to an end, it's not soon enough for Kathleen's family. In a statement, they questioned why it took over 40 years to get an indictment accusing prosecutors of protecting the Durst family and the NYPD of failing to conduct competent and a thorough investigation into Kathleen's disappearance. They said in a statement, "We want both closure and justice for Kathie and our family who has suffered from her disappearance, murder, and concealment of her remains." There may also be other potential victims that could be connected to Durst, and we're going to discuss those now. On December 10th, 1971, in Middlebury, Vermont, Lynn Schultz went into a health food store called All Good Things. There she purchased some dried prunes. She'd been seen eating them while standing at a bus stop on Court Street around 12:30 p.m. She was 18 years old and had been a student at the Middlebury College. She returned to campus and was seen at her dorm. She left around 1 p.m. to attend a final exam but never showed up. She had last been seen at 2:15 p.m. at the same bus stop she had been at earlier, near All Good Things, and from there she vanished. Campus security did not initiate a search until 2 days after her disappearance, and the college didn't alert her parents for a week. Friends and family had noted she was homesick, but also knew she had studied relentlessly for this exam that she never got to take, and no one was able to explain why she'd never shown up, and instead had last been seen near a health food store. Her disappearance remains a cold case and is marked as a possible foul play. In 2015, authorities announced that they would be looking at Robert Durst as a possible suspect. Another young woman went missing, this time in 1997. Karen Mitchell was 16 and living in Eureka, California. Karen had visited her aunt's store on November 25, 1997, and she was headed to her part-time job at the Coastal Family Development Center. She was last seen walking down the road, and some witnesses claim they saw her get into a vehicle with an older man driving. The car was described as a blue Ford Granada or a Mercury Monarch or a Nissan. The driver was described as a Caucasian male approximately 50 to 70 years old with a balding, light gray or sandy blonde hair. The unidentified man had green or gray eyes and a large-sized nose that appeared to have been previously broken. He had a small build and wore eyeglasses. The driver was wearing a long-sleeve button-down light blue shirt. A missing person report was filed later that day by her aunt, who would learn she'd never made it to work when she went to pick up Karen. Extensive searches were undertaken, which had even included sniffer dogs. It was as if she had dropped off the face of the planet. The driver was never located for questioning. Durst's connection was credit card charges putting him in the area of her disappearance. He also owned a home only 25 minutes from Eureka in Trinidad, California. He sold the home in 2000 after the murder of Susan Berman. It wasn't until the body of Morris Black washed up that Durst was finally brought to justice, though had his body not been found so quickly, it likely would have been lost forever, taking with it all the evidence that had connected Durst to the murder. The medical examiner that had done the autopsy for Morris Black had noticed that the cuts had been precise and practiced. Based on how Black's body had been dismembered, the medical examiner had thought that the person responsible had either medical training or had been a hunter. Durst was neither, and it called into question how he got so skilled at disposing of murder victims. Durst had also used several aliases while he traveled. He also used several different social security numbers to rent cars, hotel rooms, credit cards, and rent apartments. Many of these aliases were people he knew from school, real people that had very faint connections to Durst. His aliases included Robert Allen Durst, a man of no relation but an exact same name, Robert Dean Jasowski, an old schoolmate, Ralph Durst, Everett Ward, James Cordes, Jim Turse, James S. Fleischman, Johnny Smith, Emilio Vignoli, Dorothy Siner, Diane Wynn, James Closty, and Morris Black. And those are only the ones that we can connect to Robert Durst. While he was traveling across the country, he often rented older cars, never anything flashy. He would dress down in inexpensive clothing, sometimes in full drag, and would often try and be as nondescript as possible. He would rent dirt cheap apartments across the country, paying in cash several months in advance, and disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. He would often hang around transient people, who often would disappear without a trace, only to open a credit card or rent a car years later. We may never have all the answers. Durst has faced several health issues in recent years. Though only 78, he appears to have aged dramatically, and he maintains his innocence despite exhaustive evidence against him. And to this day, it is unclear why he'd been so willing to murder Susan and Morris Black to cover up what he had done to Kathleen. Why had he been so willing to commit multiple other murders to cover up Kathleen's disappearance? There is always hope that one day he may decide to open up about what had actually happened to the people closest to him that had met untimely demises. Well, that is it for this series. Thank you so much for watching. As always, please give this video a thumbs up if you like the content and subscribe for more if you haven't already. Also, don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you get notified when I post. And if you've done all that and want to support me and the channel, we have channel membership and Patreon to get early access, members-only content, live streams, and more. We also have merch and other goodies in the description box, as well as links to all my socials. But until then, I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.